Welcome to the Utter FPL Show, a fantasy Premier League podcast. My name's Tom. Find me on Twitter at utterlytc. Hi, welcome to the Utter FPL Show. My name's Tom. Find me on Twitter at utterlytc. Now, I'm sure most of you guys will be aware that the Prem have announced that Premier League football is, provisionally set to return from June 17th, which is obviously exciting for all of us. The Fantasy Premier League announcement that is available on their website was particularly sort of carefully worded, I thought, but they have made reference to the game restarting on the basis that the Premier League schedule is upheld as per the current expectations. And the way that they phrased it is that opening fixtures will be the remaining ones from game week 29, for those of us who can remember that far back. And that will include Man City hosting Arsenal and Sheffield United travelling to Aston Villa as part of those scheduled fixtures. So what do we know? Well, we know that those fixtures are going to make up part of a double game week's worth of fixtures. So in addition to those two that I mentioned there will be a full first round of games. The fixtures immediately following them taking place on the Wednesday evening. So that's right. We are looking at a returning double game week to kick things off when the Fantasy Premier League game returns, which is super exciting for those of us who are still interested in the game. I guess for those of you who are listening, that would constitute the listening audience, I would think. But we know that there are lots of unknowns in terms of even the fixtures. So whilst it's known the remaining games that need to be played as of recording, the actual schedule in terms of upholding those fixtures isn't yet confirmed. So we'll know those soon, but that qualifies as an unknown right now, the fixtures. Another unknown is, of course, whether or not the game will decide to grant unlimited transfers up until the point that the game restarts, or indeed give another wild card, which may or may not be expected to have to be played before the game's resumption. So absolutely, I think it's really important to note that, there are a lot of unknowns at this particular point of the season, hopefully restarting. And of course, the pandemic itself may yet cause, untold delays and issues as we go through what is clearly a pretty precarious position. So whilst I accept that there's an awful lot that we don't know, what we do know is that the game is at least scheduled to return. So I thought what I would do is put together some content which hopefully will prove to be interesting for those folks who are looking to reintroduce themselves to thinking about how their team may look as we look to flesh out those squads and become re-familiar with how we left them all those months ago. So what exactly are we going to talk about today? So the running order of this show is that I'm going to be talking about some players who particularly impressed over the beginning part of the season, that being game weeks 1 through 4. So the reason I wanted to do that is that I don't believe that the concept of form is particularly applicable at the moment, having had so much time without any football being played. So whilst we could look at, those players who were particularly impressive, prior to the season meeting such a curtailed, abrupt end a few months back, I'm not entirely sure that that's going to add much value at this point. I know I've mentioned also fixtures have a degree of uncertainty at the moment, so can't really look too much into which teams have good runs of upcoming game in their remaining fixtures, in my view, at least not yet. Whilst you can sort of look at the broad brush approach and see which teams have good runs right across the remaining 9 or 10 game weeks, and I do think that's important to do. Clearly, the order of those games hasn't yet been decided, so it'd be a bit presumptuous and a bit premature to look at those, I thought. So the last point where I thought, that's probably not something that we could discuss freely is the fitness of players. I think it's pretty universally accepted that is an unknown right now. Clearly, there are some cases where people have already, unfortunately, got themselves injured as the teams return to contact training. But fitness is a big unknown at the moment, especially for those players who are coming back from longer term injuries. So all of that said, I thought what would be quite interesting to do is to focus on a few of the sort of quote-unquote attacking players, so the midfielders and the strikers, outside of the ubiquitous ones like your Mo Salahs and Sadio Mane, KDB, etc., who I sort of take it as read that people will naturally gravitate to potentially looking to include those players, and actually look at all the way back at the beginning of this season, who started it well and who might be of interest as a consequence of that. By that I mean, who were the players who demonstrated particularly strong returns from an FPL points perspective over a period of prolonged inactivity and a pre-season, i.e. the summer. And you may ask yourself, well, is that particularly relevant? I don't think there's any great way of knowing as to whether or not that how relevant this will be, but I did think it would at least be interesting and in my view kind of something that we might want to consider when we're looking at our transfer strategies for the return of the game. So perhaps it's relevant. I would take it for what it is. This is a retrospective look back as to those players from a pretty small period. I'm looking at game weeks 1 through 4. And see how they did and see who stood out from the underlying numbers outside, as I say, from the typical big hitters that we're all too well aware of. So hopefully you find that interesting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 2 midfielders and 2 forwards from that period and call out what particularly made me, or rather what made them stand out from their peers. And then what I'm going to do is look at the players who I noticed performed particularly well against both the better defences, and I will talk about how I'm qualifying that particular categorisation, and those who were particularly effective against the utter sieve defences. I'm a West Ham fan, so well versed in understanding how it appears to see someone perform against such a defence. The thought process there being that if you look back to say how the Bundesliga has manifest following its resumption after the pandemic being, or the lockdown procedures in Germany being relaxed, I've seen a lot of goals being conceded. And I think what that says to me is if we identify returning sides who are particularly porous, that's not to say the ones who were before the COVID-19 took hold of the country will necessarily perform in the same way. They may do, we'll see. But whichever defences are particularly porous, as I say, I thought it may be helpful to know who's impressed against those comparatively weaker ones in the past. So that's what we're going to do, and we'll get right into it after this. So the first midfielder who stood out amongst the numbers that I looked at is Mason Mount. So he's currently priced at 6.2 million. And throughout game weeks 1 through 4, he picked up 2 goals, 0 assists. And that was a game week period that included an away match at Man United, home match to Leicester, away match at Norwich, and a home match to Sheffield United as well. So pretty mixed level of opponent, you would say. In terms of points and minutes over that particular period, he was 7th for midfielders for points. So he picked up 22 points over the first 4 game weeks. That was an average of 5 points per game week. So other than David Silva, 7.3 million, all those midfielders who were ahead of him for that period were, significantly more expensive, at least 2 million more in price. So from a value perspective, he was standing out during the opening part of the season. So Raheem Sterling, 37 points, Mo Salah, 36, KDB, 36, Mane, 25. So as I say, the analysis, I did include those players, but let's be honest, it's not really particularly groundbreaking for me to say, go ahead and look at the likes of Raheem Sterling and Mo Salah when you put together your FPL team. But he stood out. He was 7th, as I say, for points over that period. In terms of points per million, it was a real highlight for Mount. He was actually only behind Todd Cantwell, who's someone else who I think it would do well to consider. He was 4.7 million and picked up a points per million rating, if you like, of 4.6. And of course, KDB, as I mentioned, so 10.6 million. He was averaging 3.8 or returning 3.8 points per million, as I say. And Mount is just behind KDB with 3.6. So it was an impressive return for Mason Mount in terms of the points return for the opening 4 game weeks. And those performances didn't go unnoticed, I should say, in the bonus points. He picked up 4 in those opening 4 game weeks. So in terms of minutes, perhaps surprisingly, as we consider how it went further on in the campaign, but he played 359 minutes of potentially 360 over that period. So he was an absolute lock at the beginning of the season when he came in from having had a pre-season and started the campaign under Lampard. So he was locked into the side and he was returning well, despite, as I say, a pretty mixed range of opponents, you could say. So if we look at some of the underlying numbers that I guess helped constitute those returns, he was top for shots with 14 of midfielders, 1 ahead of Mo Salah and James Maddison, and 2 ahead of Raheem Sterling and KDB with 12. And he was joint for he was joint for shots on target with 7, again alongside Sterling. So for those of us who know Mason Mount's game, we may be sort of immediately thinking, well, that's all well and good, thinking he was returning decently on the shot metric, but were all of those shots being taken from distance? My analysis suggests that no, that's not the case. When we look at shots in the box, though, it's 5. So again, reminder, he has top for shots with 14. Shots in the box, it's 5, which puts him alongside the likes of Tony Martial, Callum Robinson, Paul Pogba. Those are the sorts of players that you'd match up to him in terms of shots in the box. So I guess the next thing to consider is how accurate those shots were. He was 3rd for minutes per shot on target, so 51 of all midfielders. And the 2 ahead of him are the now departed Christian Eriksen and Dan James, respectively. So for me, that's a really impressive return, actually. Yes, he was shooting a lot, albeit not all of them from in the box, as I say, but they did tend to strike the target on a pretty regular and frequent basis. So from a shooting perspective, it's ticking boxes in that initial campaign and in terms of how he started the season. If we wanted to look at creativity as well as the, attacking direct threat from a goals perspective, it's actually quite a pleasant story there as well. He had 8 attempted assists, which in a 4-game week period isn't spectacular. It's half that of Kevin De Bruyne. But for context, it is ahead of the likes of David Silva and level with, quote unquote, creative players like Christian Eriksen and Jack Grealish. So from my perspective, the 2 metrics typically associated with getting decent points returns in FPL, goals and assists respectively from a midfielder, Mason Mount at the beginning of the season was a real standout and still represents real value at 6.2 million. So he may be somebody that you'd like to consider. Now, the other one is probably a harder sell. So it's Daniel James of Man United. So he is 5.8 million at the moment. And game weeks 1 through 4 saw him return 3 goals, 0 assists. And the games that Man United faced in that period, just as a little refresher, a home game against Chelsea, away match against Wolves that followed, a home match against Crystal Palace, and then away at Southampton. So again, pretty mixed in terms of the quality of the defences that he was up against, I say. So in terms of points and minutes, if we look at Dan James's initial output, he was just a single point behind Mount, actually, for that same period. 21 he got for the first 4 game weeks. So, that's still right around that kind of 5 points per game week score. And I think if somebody was to say to you, your midfielders are going to return 5 points per game week, that's a pretty reasonable return that you'd be pretty happy with most weeks. So, something that we could be pretty content with, I guess, for that initial period. Going back to the points per million, I mentioned the figures of KDB and Mount recently, and he was again just behind that with 3.5 points per million relative to his price. So again, representative of real value. Where I think he differs from Mount is that he's way less nailed on in terms of selection. He played 285 minutes played, and even though he prefers playing, on the left-hand side of midfield, he was actually typically being deployed on the right because of who Man United had available to them. And there's no way that we can be sure as to how much he's going to feature with the likes of Bruno Fernandes coming, slotting in and being so integral to Man United straight away. The returning Paul Pogba to be shoehorned into that midfield as well. But that's not to say that he won't feature at all, particularly with there being 5 substitutes permissible. And in terms of how Dan James hit the ground running, his points returns were impressive. So if we look at the same sorts of things that I mentioned with Mount in relation to his propensity to shoot, again, you've got a midfielder here who was really happy to shoot. He took 11 shots in that period, which was 6th overall of all midfielders, and 9 of them instead coming from inside the box rather than Mount's sort of much lesser proportion there. As mentioned in the previous analysis, his shots on target per minute stat of 48 was second best of all midfielders. So shooting wise, it was impressive for Dan James over that period, and that also was backed up with touches in the opponent's box. So 21 touches in the opponent's box in that 4 game week period puts him behind only Mo Salah and Sterling in terms of midfielders, both of whom had 34. So just in terms of 2 slightly potentially under the radar picks in terms of midfielders who may be budget enabling, Mason Mount and Dan James are my recommendations in terms of those that particularly stood out over the game weeks 1 through 4 period. Okay, so if we look further up the field and actually begin to look at the forwards, then somebody who's already featuring pretty prevalently, I guess, on Twitter and some of the other social medias in relation to FPL is Marcus Rashford, and that's no surprise. He is currently at 8.8 million, and in game weeks 1 through 4, he picked up 2 goals and 1 assist. Just a refresher again of the fixtures that Man United had in that period. It was home to Chelsea, away to Wolves, home to Crystal Palace, and away to Southampton. So in terms of his point returns over that period, he picked up 21 points over the first 4 game weeks, which is impressive enough in of itself. But I thought it was worth reminding everyone that did include a 90-minute 0-pointer against Palace, which came as a consequence of a missed penalty. So the points total of just over 5 points per game is, slightly lower than we would perhaps reasonably have expected, bearing in mind that, a penalty we would expect strikers to typically convert. So we do have a question mark over whether or not those penalty duties will continue, with Bruno Fernandes coming into the side and, owning that job so confidently. Who's to say, getting both may be completely sensible in terms of actually covering either eventuality and depending on who's on the pitch at any particular moment. So that was an impressive return. Minutes-wise, it was 355, absolutely ample across that first 4 game period, right around the 90-minute mark, averaging across the game weeks 1 through 4. But, of course, Rashford hasn't played any football since game week 22. Christ, that feels like a long, long time ago. And the nature of his injury at the time it was reported appeared to be sort of worryingly chronic in nature. So I guess there are still question marks as to just how fit he will be for the resumption of the season. But if he's, if it comes out and he's reported that he's good to go, then based on how he started the season, based on that price of 8.8 million and those initial returns, then it's pretty impressive and pretty exciting on the Marcus Rashford perspective. If we look at the shots metrics that underpin those performances, it was, again, really impressive. So he was second for overall shots with 16 of all strikers, behind only Roberto Firmino, 3 ahead of Sergio Aguero as well, and he averaged 4 shots per game, which was, again, second of all strikers. If we look at the number of big chances that Rashford actually picked up during that period, he was top with 5, though he did have 2 scored 1 and missed 1 penalties in that period against Chelsea and Crystal Palace respectively, which would absolutely constitute a big chance, of course, and he may well have relinquished those duties to Bruno Fernandes, as I mentioned. So he was getting big chances as well, notwithstanding the penalties that United picked up. If we look at his shots on target, so how many of the 16 that he had actually finding the target, that wasn't too offensive. It was 5, so puts him alongside peers like Aubameyang, Jimenez and Firmino, none of whom you'd say are particularly profligate, I guess. So that didn't worry me too much. And in terms of the average shots per 90, he was ranked 4th for average shots per 90 with 3.1. and third for average big chances per 90 with just under 1 when I looked at performances versus the stronger defences, and I'm going to expand on that in a moment as well. So I guess there are question marks over how fit he'll be. We know Odion Ighalo's been retained now until January, and Tony Martial's been deployed pretty consistently as a number 9 for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. But they do still have a lot to compete for, and they were running into some pretty handy form prior to the season coming to an end, rather coming to a sort of paused conclusion. So I'd say he's intriguing. It's an exciting prospect. It's a great price, and he absolutely could benefit from Man United's favourable upcoming games, despite how we don't yet know how those games will absolutely look. We do know who those opponents will be, and the upcoming games from Man United are favourable. So Marcus Rashford is a player who's of particular interest. Similarly, another striker who stood out, alongside the likes of who we may have expected, and I think I probably should say at the moment that Teemu Pukki's someone who people may have expected me to mention, but I think it was quite apparent to those who are close to the game and that big initial part of the season and the start that Pukki got with his return away at Anfield and then the hat-trick that followed against Newcastle. I thought that was a little bit too obvious to talk about there. Plus his underlying stats weren't actually spectacular, so I'm going to talk about him in detail, but someone else who did actually impress is Tammy Abraham. So Tammy Abraham's priced at 7.5 million. And he picked up 4 goals in the opening 4 games, 0 assists, and a reminder of the Chelsea fixtures for game weeks 1 through 4 were away at Man United, home to Leicester, away at Norwich, and home to Sheffield United. And Abraham actually managed to pick up 28 points after the first 4 game weeks, which is, a fantastic return. It's behind only the likes of Pukki, as I mentioned, and Sergio Aguero. Impressive in of itself, but what makes it more marked to me is that he was rocking a 2-point total after the first 2 game weeks, following back-to-back 1-pointers away at Man United and hosting Leicester, as I mentioned, having played 94 minutes in total. So if we were to only have looked at those opening 2 game weeks, there's no way that he would have featured. So what followed, though, for Abraham was back-to-back braces at Norwich and home to Sheffield United. Minutes-wise, Tammy didn't play 90 until game week 9. He was often hooked around the 75-minute, 80-minute mark by Frank Lampard. Over the first 4 game weeks, it was relatively consistent as well. It was 254 minutes played, which was around about a 65-minute average, which was kind of a source of frustration, I guess, for an owner, but it's probably something that we might have to get a little bit more used to now that managers are able to make 5 substitutes in games following the resumption of the Premier League season. So that was something to be aware of. He wasn't a 90-minute man, but, he was new to the league at that time. He's a young player. I'd say he's perhaps more trusted now by Lampard, and he's certainly more familiar with the quality of the opposition that he's expected to face and the pace of the Premier League as was. But I couldn't argue he's a definite 90-minute man, even though Chelsea do absolutely still have the Champions League to compete for. If we look at the output for Abraham over that period, what's noticeable is that Tammy features in the charts for that period despite those opening 2 game weeks failure, if you like. He picked up 11 shots, 9 in the box and 5 on target. So those aren't bad numbers, actually. It's consistently around sort of 5th to 8th of all strikers for that period. Not massively impressive, 5th to 8th of all strikers if you're looking to, fill your treasured 3 spots from selecting an FPL squad. But he found form in those 2 game weeks, as I say, 3 and 4. And I do think it's important to note as well, if you just extend that period by 1 and look at game week 5, it was another brace versus Wolves, and we know that Wolves have a pretty tight defence as well. So Tammy Abraham's initial output, despite the first 2 game weeks, was impressive. He was second for attempted assists as well, which is a metric that I like looking at for all players, actually, including strikers. And second for attempted assists of all strikers with 6, sort of suggesting that there's more to his game than just scoring in terms of, avenues for points returns in Fantasy Premier League. So I guess the question is he a flat track bully? Potentially, I'd say. But when we look at his performance over the whole season versus the stronger defences, he averaged 1 big chance a game. Had a minutes per shot of every 31 minutes, which is actually better than the likes of Raheem Sterling, Son, Aguero, Sadio Mane. He was averaging a point every 15 and a half minutes. And I thought, a decent that may not mean much to people listening, but averaging a point every 15 and a half minutes in FPL puts you alongside Bruno Fernandes, who at the moment is looking at a point every 15 minutes. And, people have rightly waxed lyrical about how impressive he's been. So I really like the look of Abraham in terms of that initial start to his season. And as I mentioned, Chelsea still absolutely are a team that have something to compete for. So he may be somebody else that people look to when they look to consider their strikers. So when we come back in a moment, I'm going to take a look at the outfield players who've really impressed against the stronger defences, and then also their peers who've stood out versus those weak defences as well. Okay, for this section of the podcast, what I wanted to do is to sort of get into the underlying expected goals conceded stats and see which outfield players have particularly impressed versus the stronger defences. So I looked at the expected goals conceded stats at team level, and basically the best performing teams were, probably no surprise, were Man City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Man United, Wolves, Leicester, Everton and Sheffield United. And I've basically looked at performances against those stronger defences for players who've played at least 180 minutes against them over the course of the season. So hopefully that makes sense. We're basically looking to isolate individual performances against the strongest performing team defences. And there's a man who stands out. His name is Danny Ings. So Danny Ings is 7.1 million. And relative to those sides, he really did actually impress. His season stats are actually super impressive anyway. He's picked up 15 goals this season already. 1 assist, not so impressive there, but 28 bonus points is awesome. And I think we've all spoken about that online in terms of when he does well, in terms of his goals, he does love to pick up a bonus point as well. And that's part of the reason that he's now sitting on 148 points for the season. So if we look at the compelling stats as to why Ings stood out in these performances against the stronger defences, Ings is actually top of all players for shots on target versus them with 15. It's possibly no surprise to those of us who've followed Ings's games. He's renowned for his clinical finishing, and I guess that is borne out in the statistics with 15 shots on target and topping the pile in terms of taking those shots against the stronger defences. He's third for overall shots as well with 32. Against those teams, behind only Mo Salah and Riyad Mahrez, respectively. So, despite not featuring in a side, I guess, particularly famed for its expansive play, that's putting it mildly, he's shooting heaps against sides known to be tight, which is, again, something we might want to consider if we identify teams who are particularly strong when they return from the enforced break. He's second for shots in the box with 27, just one behind Roberto Firmino. And it didn't appear that one game was particularly skewing this data. He was, or is rather, averaging more than 2 shots in the box per game against these tougher defences. So the underlying statistics in terms of the volume of shots is really compelling. So I guess the question is, does that translate, or did that translate, into points? And I would say yes, it did. He got a point every 17 minutes against these tough oppositions, which is, better than the likes of Mo Salah, Raul Jimenez, Raheem Sterling, etc. That's really impressive in itself to be returning an FPL point every 17 minutes on average against strong defences. The caveat here, I guess, is going to come as no surprise. We need to be mindful of his minutes. He's whether or not it's still fair to say that he's thought of as a player that's quote unquote made of glass, that I'll leave to you as a listener to decide. But what's undeniable is that he's averaged right around the 65-minute played mark on average against these teams. But 5 goals in that against those sides, is one short of the most of any players has mustered against those sides. So Ings has really, really stood out. When I looked at these statistics, and yes, the top brass, of course, are absolutely still milling about, as you would expect. But if you were looking for someone who stands out amongst them, and he's reasonably priced, as I say, 7.1 million, Danny Ings is the person who really did leap to the surface there. So why don't we take a look now against the players who've really stood out against those god-awful defences. So, different way of doing this, or I guess the same approach, but of course the teams included changed dramatically here. So I was now looking at outfield players versus the worst 5 teams, so in terms of expected goals conceded. So those teams, you could probably guess if you had a choice of naming 5. I think you'd probably all get them pretty accurate. There's Aston Villa, West Ham United, Norwich, Newcastle United and Bournemouth, respectively. And again, I was looking for players who'd had a minimum of 2 shots against those teams and had played at least 90 minutes when I put together my statistical tables for this. So looking at FPL points accrued versus those, pitiful defences, the usual names did tend to float to the surface. I thought it was worth just pointing out Salah's dominance here. He was way out in front with 69 points in less than 700 minutes against those defences, which is frankly extraordinary. Next up, though, is a player I did want to mention who may have been a little bit forgotten, and that's Jamie Vardy. So Jamie Vardy has some incredible stats here, actually. He has accrued 58 points, which is against these sides, So 35% of his total of 167 points has come against these weak defences. He's been hitting an FPL point every 7.5 minutes against these really weak defences. And that's comparable with the only 2 players it's comparable with in terms of those, 0.2 minutes average is Sadio Mane and Riyad Mahrez, respectively. You've got similar minute statistics. So it did surprise me a little bit. Vardy, I think, historically has been thought of as somebody you can play against the big teams, quite rightly, as historically that played out. But in terms of the last season, that wasn't necessarily the case. He was really impressing against those weaker defences. Maybe I thought it was also worth a reminder that Vardy's game, and indeed Leicester, does lend itself to Vardy picking up bonus points as well. He's picked up 11 bonus points against those sides, which is, again, top with the aforementioned Mo Salah as well. So in terms of a player who's looking to bully these sides most, I don't think that's necessarily how you'd say Vardy's game is. Outside of those no-brainers, another player who's interesting here is Chris Wood, 6.1 million. He looks kind of interesting as well. So he was top for XG against these sides with 5.7. So no surprise, as he had 12 big chances against those sides, which is actually a really high number when you consider it was just those five teams. Kind of hard to determine a root cause without more of a deep dive into that, but we do know that his and Burnley's style does seem to have been more telling against the weaker defences, which might be something that you, as an FPL manager, might look to exploit when it comes to picking your strikers for the remaining games of the season. I thought, interestingly, and just as a kind of final point here in terms of this particular metric, Neil Maupay, he shot at will against this calibre of opposition. 39 shots, 9 more than the second-placed Mo Salah. A shot every 14 minutes, top for shots in the box. So is it a case of bye? That's a hard no from me. There's 0 goals for Neil. So sorry, Mr. Maupay, you don't quite qualify. But I did find it interesting that he was very much a shoot on sight against these teams. So the so what of it? Obviously, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that the amount of unknowns at the point that we are in this season are plentiful. There's no form. We don't have a definitive steer on fitness. There's question marks over relative motivation of teams. There's a degree of fixture uncertainty. There's the known short turnaround between games. There are more subs permitted. There's the FPL decision, which is at the moment unknown in terms of having unlimited transfers, potentially an additional chip. Probably, a ton more that I've forgotten outside of those. But hey, FPL's fun. It's expected to be back. So I did find it useful to think back to a time which may or may not be at least in some way comparable. Albeit not identical, I think it is at least comparable in some way, shape or form. What I've done here is to think about how teams and players begun their seasons back at the beginning of the 2019-2020 season. Let's use what we do know. FPL managers' motivations, I guess, and opportunities as well are going to differ hugely right across the board. I'm not convinced the uptake is going to be quite what we would all have hoped for, but we'll see. So if you are looking for some ideas to consider outside of where your team might have been at the curtailment of the season, hopefully this has given you some pause for thought and just a few players who mightn't have been on your radar. So that about does it for this episode. Do hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts. Please subscribe to the podcast. I hope I'll be able to keep this going depending on how it gets received. Get hold of me on Twitter. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you all soon.